This will be assigning the values, initializing the values into the memory, Inside the initialization, this will be initializing the values. After the changes are identified and checked by this. That means after content init will be actually inside this ng init. After content checked will be inside this changes. After the view rendered, that means the output is generated. Then view initialized. And any changes occurred in the view. View is the HTML. View generally initialized with the DOM. It is initialized with the DOM. Any changes occurred inside the DOM, then it will be handled by using this event. After that, it will be destroyed. So these we don't need to worry because this part internally happens. Of course, you can override them also. These we can manually configure and we can try. Let's see that. That means how the component events will fire up. For that, different examples we need actually. First, I will show you a simple point here. Remember, one option is even when you don't define these, automatically these events will fire up. Automatically those events will fire up. We can manually write those events. In various occasions. I will show you those events while working with pipes services like concept. Means when to use init, when to use on changes, you will see practically while learning about services and other concepts. We will see them. So as of now, I am generating a component, some life cycle. Okay, skip test is equal to true. Okay, this life cycle component, when it is generated, technically, you can observe that by default, you can observe here the life cycle component TS file. Once you go into the TS file, you can see clearly the life cycle component TS file. You can observe the TS file here. You can see this component is actually configured with initialize ng on init, on initialization. And the life cycle is implementing on initialization. On initialization, it can do some functionality. If you are implementing on initialization, that means you have to tell some functionality to happen on initialization. It is mandatory because this on init is an interface. That means it contains the rules. So when I go to definition, you can see ng on init is an interface. And this interface is having a mandatory method to implement. That is ng on init. It is not an optional method, so it is mandatory to implement. So when you are configuring on init, you have to implement it. So technically, we have to initialize. Let's see how it will happen here. So I will access this life cycle TS here. Generally, all these days we were just adding the component, and we are cleaning up actually this part. So you see here, so we are configuring. So I will remove this now. This is how our component was there earlier. I want this component. Actually, one of the main thing you need to understand is, even you don't have those events written here, internally those events will be working. For every component, internally those events are working. Initialization, changes, do check, all these events are working internally. So for example, I will keep this in the startup. Life cycle. Yeah. And app life cycle. Okay. So cycle. Okay. And that is what we defined here. App life cycle. Okay. Now you can see here. So it is starting with that app life cycle works. Now on the initialization, I want some functionality to happen. So press F12 function key. You will get the debugger. You'll get the debugger. You can see in this debugger, it is showing Angular is running in the development mode. Call enable this. And here we are trying to use these events. So we are trying to use these events. So let's try to use those events actually. So these are the options it is happening. Okay, first it is loading and it is enabled and it is running. Now here in the component, I am writing an event ng on init. Ng on init. I am defining a functionality. That means console.log. And here I am defining component initialize. So that is the option I have defined for the life cycle on init. This is a reserved function. Component initialize. And when I see this here in the output, you can see that the component initialize. That means first, actually before the initialization, on changes will occur. Now when I am writing that event also here, that means I am writing here the event. So ng on changes. I'm writing that event. So console.log. I'm defining as changes detected. I'm writing that event like this. Now you can see here in the output here, only component initializer is there. Ng changes is not working, because this will be working whenever any property is binding with the value. And not only that, if any changes are performed inside those properties and values, whenever any changes are performed inside the properties and values of this component, then this will fire up. Until that moment, this event is not going to fire up. So you can see that it is not using that ng changes, because that will be happened only when there are properties and binding defined.